Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Across Eurasia, Russia's retreat is often described as a vacuum. But vacuums do not like to stay empty for long. From Central Asia to the South Caucasus, Moscow's preoccupation with Ukraine has weakened the structures that once held these regions in place. What is emerging instead is not a new hegemon, but something far more unstable. A crowded geopolitical space where influence is fragmented, security guarantees are thin, and local governments are forced to navigate competing interests without a clear safety net. That's why we are looking at what comes after Russia. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Central Asia, long viewed as a core component of Russia's near abroad, has been undergoing a profound strategic transformation. Since 2022, Russian capacity to dominate the region has been significantly weakened by military engagement in Ukraine and the resulting strain on its economy and foreign policy bandwidth. In this context, Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Turkmenistan have increasingly adopted multi-vector foreign policies, seeking to balance relations with traditional partner Russia against opportunities offered by other global actors. This shift reflects both a desire for greater autonomy and a pragmatic recognition that Moscow's ability to project power across Asia has been constrained. Beijing's economic engagement is anchored in the Belt and Road Initiative, including the China, Central Asia, West Asia Economic Corridor, now crucially avoiding Russian territory. China's investments span energy infrastructure, transport links and trade networks. Chinese trade volumes with Central Asian states have reached record levels, underscoring the depth of its economic footprint.
The Central Asia-China format has connected us with silk threads, defining new horizons for building a community of common historical destiny.
The European Union has also stepped up its engagement, driven by strategic interests in diversification, energy cooperation, and connectivity projects that reduce dependence on Russia.
It is amazing to see how wide our partnership is by now, whether you look at trade or investment or clean energy, tourism, connectivity, the list is very long.
The United States, while comparatively less economically invested, has also sought to maintain influence through diplomatic outreach and economic engagement. Washington's focus has included trade initiatives and political dialogue aimed at reinforcing Central Asian sovereignty and stability amid great power competition. What emerges is not a simple replacement of one hegemon with another, but a complex multipolar engagement where Central Asia's states pursue diversified partnerships to safeguard sovereignty and foster development.
And now, let's zone in on the east-planning portion of our show. Russia's preoccupation with this war in Ukraine has opened space for other powers to engage more actively in the South Caucasus as well. Armenia and Azerbaijan, the two central states of the South Caucasus, are redefining their diplomatic alliances and security strategies in a landscape where Moscow can no longer act as a sole arbiter.
The Kremlin's failure to intervene effectively during Azerbaijan's military operations in Nagorno-Karabakh and its broader limited responsiveness to regional crises have weakened the perception of Russia as a reliable security provider. As a consequence, Armenia and Azerbaijan have moved toward a more autonomous regional engagement. Yerevan's decision in 2022 to decline a CSTO border mission in favor of inviting an EU civilian mission is emblematic of this shift. This transformation has attracted broader engagement from external powers. Turkey has deepened its strategic cooperation with Azerbaijan, reinforcing Ankara's role in regional security and economic integration. Tehran, wary of Turkish Azeri expansion and seeking to balance its influence, has also increased its involvement in diplomatic and economic arenas. At the same time, the European Union has expanded their presence, supporting economic cooperation, peace initiatives and governance ties as part of a broader effort to encourage stability and reduce Russia's exclusive grip. Despite Russia's retreat from a hegemonic role, it has not disappeared entirely from the South Caucasus. Moscow continues to maintain military assets and uses political and economic levers where possible to safeguard its interests. However, its capacity to unilaterally shape regional outcomes has been fundamentally diminished.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. What Central Asia and the South Caucasus now have in common is not simply that Russia's influence is weakening. It is that both regions are learning what comes after dominance and discovering that the absence of a hegemon does not automatically translate into stability. For decades, Moscow functioned as the system manager across much of the post-Soviet space. It enforced red lines, froze conflicts, regulated elites, and absorbed the political cost of keeping fragile regional orders intact. That role was often frequently exploitative and ultimately self-serving, but it was also structurally stabilizing. Since 2022, that system has been breaking down. What we are now seeing in both Central Asia and the South Caucasus is not a clean transition to a new order, but a period of unmanaged pluralism. Multiple external actors are present. Local governments have more room to maneuver, yet no single power or coalition is willing or able to provide security guarantees comparable to those Russia once claimed to offer. In Central Asia, the erosion of Russian dominance has encouraged governments to diversify partnerships and assert greater agency. But the absence of a security anchor also raises uncomfortable questions. The region faces shared vulnerabilities, from water scarcity and labor migration pressure to border disputes and the risk of instability spilling over from Afghanistan. Russia once acted as the default crisis manager, even when it failed. Today, there is no equivalent mechanism. In the South Caucasus, the problem is even more acute. The collapse of the old Russian brokered order has removed not only constraints, but also buffers. Conflicts that were once frozen are now being resolved, but now asymmetrically and largely on the terms of the stronger party. What unites these two regions is therefore not just Russia's retreat, but the challenge of governing insecurity without a patron. And this is where the limits of external engagement becomes visible. China, the European Union, Turkey, Iran, the United States, they all have interests in these regions. All are present, but none are offering comprehensive security umbrellas. Their engagement is selective. Economic corridors without military guarantees, diplomacy without enforcement, investment without long-term responsibility for outcomes. Great powers increasingly seek influence without entanglement, access without obligation. For local governments, this creates a new kind of statecraft. Survival no longer depends on loyalty to a single center, but on constant calibration, managing overlapping partnerships and preventing overdependence on any one actor. It is far more demanding from the sovereignty than the old patron-client model. Yet, there is also an opportunity. The decline of Russian dominance has shattered a rigid hierarchy that constrained regional imagination for decades. Whether that opportunity is realized depends less on external powers than on regional choices. The age of post-Soviet certainty is over. What replaces it is still being written, and the outcome is far from guaranteed. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Andreas Umland, analyst from the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
So with Russia preoccupied with Ukraine, we're seeing their involvement slowly decrease in the Eurasia region. Would you characterize this vacuum as sort of an absence or more of a fragmentation of influence?
I think it's simply a matter of resources, as Russia's resources are now very much concentrated on Ukraine, both the human resources, the material resources. There's simply not much more that Russia can do outside this theater of war. Mm-hmm. And other countries are taking advantage of that in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, and Russia is losing global influence.
Right. So you're mentioning how other countries are taking advantage of it. I'm curious whether the weakening of Russian dominance in the Eurasian region create either as instability or opportunity.
That's a good question. I think it's both, because there's also now a competition, let's say, in Central Asia ongoing between a country like Turkey and on the one side and China on the other side. The US and the EU are also active in this region. Japan is also looking at this region. So there are different players, and that is an opportunity, but also, of course, can quickly turn into a matter of instability.
Right. With all these players involved, do you think that they will be able to provide the sort of security guarantee that Russia have been doing for quite some time?
Well, the Russian security guarantees are, as we know, of a very peculiar nature. Armenia has perhaps been the country, apart from Ukraine, that has most bitterly learned about the quality of Russian security guarantees. Armenia has been a member of the Organization of the Collective Security Treaty. But when then the wars with Azerbaijan, the new wars with Azerbaijan happened, Russia did not really support Armenia. Mm-hmm. And when push comes to shove, these security guarantees are selectively applied, or they are simply applied in a way that benefits Russia and is not something that is of interest to these countries. So I think at the end of the day, this loss of Russian influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia, and as well as in some other regions, is only to the benefit of these regions.
Right. A lot of people are describing this these post-Soviet space entering a phase of unmanaged pluralism. And like you mentioned as well, a lot of these places might develop sort of hotspots. Do you envision any particular countries that might go into a sort of conflict or tension?
In the Caucasus, I think Georgia and Armenia, and in fact even Azerbaijan as well, are potentially unstable countries because they have an ambivalent geopolitical position, each of them in its own way. Azerbaijan, just to remind, was once also on a course towards sort of westernization and towards a closer cooperation with the European Union and NATO. But then after 2008, after the Russian-Georgian War, the national strategy of Azerbaijan was changed. Georgia seemed to be on the way towards NATO and the EU, but is now in some sort of murky situation in which it is moving closer to Russia. And Armenia has been a traditional partner of Russia in the Caucasus, but Armenia is now under its leader, under its new leader, changing its orientation. So each of these countries, I think, will be going through some sort of transition in the future. And in Central Asia, maybe it's a more frozen situation. But there as well, one could imagine in the future that certain countries will have political turmoil, either domestic or external political turmoil again.
Right. When talking about Georgia, I do find it quite paradoxical seeing that, again, Russia being occupied by Ukraine and being severely weakened because of the war. We'd imagine their influence being a little bit weaker. But again, in Georgia, it does seem like they are taking that trajectory as well. How can we explain some of these phenomena where countries are still leaning and still being swayed by the Russian perspective, even though the country itself does not provide any tangible benefits?
Obviously, in Georgia, this whole switch away from European and Euro-Atlantic integration is heavily supported by Russia. And in a way, Georgia's problem is that it has a border with Russia. It's a very small country. Already 2 regions of Georgia are occupied by Russia, the Svan Valley region and Abkhazia. And so these smaller countries are, of course, in a difficult situation because they could still be targets of Russian expansionism even though there is the Russian-Ukrainian war, because the countries are relatively small, so it wouldn't take that many Russian troops to capture them, I'm afraid. So this operation, I would say, in Georgia that has been happening in the last years, this Russian operation has been successful, and it has transformed Georgian politics and also freed, in a way, Russia to be more aggressive in Ukraine, because Georgia is now an informal ally of Russia.
Right. And speaking of Azerbaijan and Armenia, we also saw Washington trying to broker a peace deal, which actually took place, even though there are skeptics about whether or not this will last. But do you think this is also going to be a pattern going forward, where countries like the United States or even other Western nations try to step in and fill that space that used to be occupied by Russia?
Yes, obviously there will be then, and there are already other actors active. What I would wish is that the European Union would become active in these countries. Armenia is potentially a future candidate for EU membership. And as I mentioned, even Azerbaijan had a European, Euro-Atlantic orientation once, but it's now, of course, under an authoritarian leader. It has a very close relationship to Turkey. And these countries, I think, will transform further. They are not in a stable or in a settled position yet, and they will have to make choices in terms of their foreign economic relations and also in their national security orientation.
Right, like you mentioned, it does kind of benefit the European Union, and they do have an incentive to step into these sort of spaces, which brings us to the question, is it the lack of effectiveness, lack of political will to step in, and that ultimately led to Washington has to be the person that brokers these peace?
I wouldn't overestimate this Azeri-Armenian peace, or I wouldn't overestimate Washington's role in this. The situation was more or less settled already before, and then Trump stepped in and invited the two leaders of the countries, and then they signed it together with Trump. So this looks like it was an American brokered peace, but I wouldn't overestimate America's role in all of that, because both countries have an interest in a stable situation. And I think both of them are also wary of Russia and Russian imperialism. So, but in general, I would say that, of course, Russia's decline, and now also economic decline, as we know from the economic data, will open opportunities, and particularly in the Southern Caucasus, I think the European Union can basically fill this gap and build on the pro-European orientation of the populations in Armenia, Georgia, and even in Azerbaijan, and can then have a beneficial influence there.
Right. Can you help us also compare how the South Caucasus and Central Asia might differ from what comes after Russia's decline?
You mean Central Asia compared to Caucasus? Yeah. Well, I mean, Central Asia, I think, is more complicated than the Caucasus, because I think many people in the Southern Caucasus see themselves as being sort of part of European civilization, even Azerbaijan. And with Central Asia, that is not that much the case. These are countries that have different orientations, and they are also more authoritarian on average than the Southern Caucasian countries. So this will perhaps they will go apart from each other. Although one never knows. I mean, countries like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, they also had phases of westernization, and perhaps they will also then look for more interaction with democratic countries, with Western countries. The two regions, one can already now say, will probably develop differently. but where exactly the differences will be is still unclear too.
Right. So like you mentioned, this might invite a lot of instability, seeing that a lot of things are still up in the air. And it's really hard to really predict what would a stable post-Russian order actually look like. So at the end of the day, I'm also curious whether or not this will be a sort of frozen conflict in a sense where things become a different configuration to what it is, or are we going to observe like a slide towards more an open, more asymmetric resolutions where things have to be resolved through conflict?
Yeah, the situation, as we already sort of discussed, is in flux there, and Russia is leaving, but still wants to have a foot in the door there. Other countries, other civilizations, one could even say, are becoming engaged in these regions. And therefore, I don't think that these regions will be that stable or that frozen in their current situation, because the world is changing. Until, I would say, 10 years ago, Russia was the dominant power in the Southern Caucasus and Central Asia. Not the only one already, but also competing with other powers. But now this is obviously over. This phase is over, and what the exact shape of these regions will be, I think, is still remains to be seen. Obviously, China wants to play a big role, but for me, the question is how much these countries want to be sort of in the Chinese orbit, and whether they may not have other orientations, like, for instance, to Turkey, to the European Union, or perhaps even to the US or Japan or other actors.
Right. So a lot, of course, is still up in the air, but it does seem like the Russia's war in Ukraine and its ripple effect is impacting the entire continent. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.